The morning began long before the sky even considered changing color. In the dim stillness, while the rest of the household still drifted in the last fragile strands of sleep, the housewife stirred. Not with a stretch or a yawn, but with a practiced urgency, an internal clock honed by years of repetition. There was no rooster crowing to wake her, not yet. She had to be up before even the rooster's job began. She sat up slowly from a simple straw mattress laid across a rough wooden frame, or sometimes just a pile of worn blankets on the earth floor. Her back ached, her knees popped, and her hands already seemed to remember the work waiting for them. The chill of the morning clung to her skin like a wet rag, especially in colder months, when frost crept through the cracks in the walls. There was no heater, no cozy blanket warmth to linger in. Heat was something you earned by labor. The room was black, no candles yet, no oil to spare. She felt around in the dark, toes finding the edge of her shoes, or sandals if she was lucky. Some mornings meant stepping barefoot onto cold stone or hard-packed earth, teeth clenching against the sting. Her garments, perhaps a woolen tunic or linen shift, were folded nearby, worn smooth by constant use. Putting them on was a quiet act of muscle memory. No mirrors, no fuss. Just a swift, silent transformation from sleeper to worker. The first task, always the first, was to coax fire back into the hearth. The fire had been banked the night before, covered in ash to keep the embers alive. She knelt before it, careful, hopeful, hands working quickly to uncover the glow. If luck was with her, a faint red would bloom beneath the gray, and she could breathe life into it. If not, she'd be starting from nothing, striking flint against steel, cursing under her breath as sparks refused to catch. Smoke curled around her face, eyes watered, and her breath caught in her throat. There was no rushing it. Fire had its own schedule. She fed it carefully, bits of straw, slivers of wood, dung patties if that's all she had. Slowly the flame emerged, hesitant and flickering, casting just enough light to outline the tiny room. That warm orange glow felt like a fragile miracle each morning. While the fire gathered its strength, she moved to the next task, fetching water. The household would need it for everything: cooking, cleaning, washing, drinking. There were no pipes, no taps, no buckets left full from the night before. Water had to be fetched every day, every time, from the same distant place. A well, a spring, or a river, wherever it flowed, she went. Before leaving, she might wrap her head in a scarf, both to contain her hair and protect from the chill or dust. She grabbed her clay jugs, heavy even when empty, and headed out the creaking door into the quiet of pre-dawn. The walk to the water source was often long, sometimes half a mile or more. The path was rarely smooth, muddy in spring, cracked in summer, icy in winter. She walked it regardless. She had to. The village might still sleep, save for the other wives already making the same pilgrimage. Silent nods were exchanged, but few words. Talking could come later. By the time she returned, her arms ached from the weight of sloshing jugs, her back bowed slightly from the strain. But there was no time to rest. The fire needed tending again, the family would soon stir, and breakfast had to be started. She filled the kettle, if she had one, and placed it over the flames. Maybe she stirred a pot of millet or barley, soaking overnight for speed. Maybe she flattened dough for flatbread, dusting it with flour made from yesterday's grinding. All of this happened while still half in shadow, long before a rooster dared to crow. And always, her ears listened. For the first cough from her husband. For the rustling of children waking in the corner. For the sound of goats beginning to stir, or chickens fluttering on their perch. Each noise was a signal, more tasks queued up behind the last. There were no quiet mornings. There were only moments where the noise hadn't started yet. The housewife's morning was an act of opening the floodgates. Once she moved, everything else would follow. If the children were young, she'd check on them next. Perhaps one had wet the bedding, or another had kicked off their covering and shivered in their sleep. She adjusted, wiped, comforted, all by instinct. Motherhood didn't wait for sunlight. She might sip something warm if there was anything spare. A thin broth, or hot water with herbs if she was lucky. But most mornings, there was no such pause. She moved from one duty to the next like a wheel that never stopped turning. The hearth, now glowing, needed new fuel. She set bread to bake, perhaps in a simple clay oven if the family had one, or directly in the embers. Burned crusts were common. So was the smell of smoke soaking into everything. With food underway, she turned to laundry if the day was right. Clothes had to be soaked before scrubbing, and even that meant more water, more effort, more walking. Or maybe she swept the floor, a dirt floor, so sweeping mostly meant moving dust from one corner to another. But it had to be done. Appearances mattered. And as the sky began to pale outside, she took a moment, not to rest, but to think. About what she might have forgotten. About the long stretch of daylight still ahead. About the next task. Always the next task. The day had only begun. And already, the housewife had done more in 2 hours than some would in an entire morning. But there would be no medal, no thanks, not even acknowledgement. Just the slow, steady rhythm of another day in a life that spun endlessly around work. She wasn't heroic. She wasn't celebrated. But without her, the household, and by extension, the village, would fall apart. All of it depended on this quiet labor. Every meal, every stitch of clothing, every clean pot and every dry floor began here. Before the sun. Before the world woke. While the sky was still dreaming. She was already working. Before anything else could truly begin, the water had to be fetched. Water was not something you could store indefinitely. Not in the ancient world. It could spoil. It could be knocked over. It could freeze in winter or go foul in the heat. And so, it had to be collected fresh. Every day. Often more than once. The housewife would rise early, sometimes before the stars had faded, and begin the first and most punishing walk of the day. Her arms still stiff from the previous day's chores. Her legs unsteady from too little sleep. But there was no delay. The household needed water. Without it, the fire couldn't be maintained. Without it, no breakfast could be made. No hands could be washed. No animals could be tended. The vessels were heavy even when empty. Clay jars, sometimes cracked and mended, waited near the door or beneath a lean to where they were last used. Some were tied with ropes to distribute the weight across the shoulders. Others had to be carried by hand. One in each arm. Or one balanced atop the head with a practiced stillness that only years of repetition could teach. There were no shortcuts to the water source. If the house was lucky enough to be near a stream, the trip might only take 15 minutes. But many walked half an hour, sometimes more, through narrow paths, past brambles, through muddy trails in spring and hard-packed dust in summer. Winters brought icy danger, where one slip could send a woman tumbling, jugs shattering, water lost. The walk itself was not quiet. Birds stirred in the trees. The creak of wood against shoulder echoed in the early air. And sometimes, depending on the region, there were distant sounds, wild dogs, foraging pigs, or the sharp cries of unseen creatures moving in the brush. The housewife walked steadily, eyes ahead, body bracing itself for what it knew came next. At the water's edge, she would often join others. Silent women. Girls old enough to help. Some chatted softly. Others worked without a word. It was a communal burden, shared but never lightened. Every house needed water, and every house sent someone to retrieve it. Almost always a woman. The water itself was not clean by modern standards. Sometimes it was cloudy. Sometimes tinged brown from rain. But it was what they had. Some scooped carefully from the top layer, avoiding the sludge stirred by the last person. Others used a cloth or net to strain out the larger bits. No one expected it to be perfect. Just usable. The filling of the jars was its own slow ritual. Each container took time. Time for the water to settle. Time to pour steadily, lest the clay crack or the handle snap. There was no room for haste. And once filled, the weight tripled. What was light, coming in was now a burden leaving. The return journey was worse. Each step heavier than the last. Back bent. Arms burning. Sometimes the rope would dig into her skin. Sometimes a jar would leak. And always, there was the dread of dropping it. One crack. One slip. And everything would spill into the earth, lost in the dust, wasted. And she would have to go back. Immediately. Children might follow. Sometimes helping, sometimes distracting. Older daughters learned to carry smaller pots. Toddlers were strapped to backs or left at home with older siblings. There was no option to not go. No breaks for tantrums. No room for excuses. And when she finally arrived back at her home, breathing heavily, she still did not rest. The jars were set down carefully. The water measured out by task. A bit for the fire. A bit for porridge. A basin for washing hands and faces. Maybe a cup left for drinking. But she would likely need to return again by midday. Dishes, animals, more cooking, all of it took water. And this water would run out fast. Even the storage was a challenge. No clean containers. No sealed vessels. Just open pots or shallow basins. Dust settled? Bugs landed. Dogs tried to drink when no one was looking. Water had to be guarded as carefully as food. And every now and then, there was drought. Or the well ran dry. Or the river shrank to a muddy trickle. Then the walk grew longer. Harder. She might leave at dawn and not return until noon. All for a few liters. Rain could help. If it was collected properly. But too much rain, and the water was undrinkable. Too little, and everything became dust. The housewife adapted. Every season. Every year. And still, no one praised her. No one marveled at the effort. Her children drank without thinking. Her husband might grunt approval if the kettle was full. But they did not see the miles in her feet. The pain in her shoulders. The danger in every trip. In many cultures, this act of fetching water defined a woman's existence. It was how girls grew into mothers. How strength was measured. How marriages were judged. Could she carry enough? Was she strong enough? Fast enough? And when she aged, her trips slowed. Her gait changed. Her daughters might take over. Or she would simply walk slower, carry less, make more trips. Even in old age, the chore never fully ended. Fetching water was not just a chore. It was an ancient ritual of survival. Of patience. Of strength cloaked in silence. A burden passed down through generations like a fragile pot, heavy, brittle, but necessary. And tomorrow, before the sun rises, she will do it all again. Before anything could be cooked, before clothes could be dried, before even a small sense of comfort could be achieved, the fire had to be lit. It sounds simple to modern ears. Turn a knob, flick a switch, strike a match. But for the ancient housewife, it was a daily battle against cold stone, damp wood, and the quiet, creeping threat of failure. Fire was life. It warmed the bones in winter, cooked every meal, boiled every pot of water, lit every dark room. And it was fragile. Fickle. Demanding. The day would often begin in cold silence. Overnight, the fire would die down to glowing coals, if the woman had been lucky, or skilled enough to bank them correctly. If not, she was greeted with ash. Cold, soft, and utterly useless ash. Which meant she would have to start from nothing. She would crouch near the hearth, her knees pressing against hard-packed dirt, or the rough stone floor. Her fingers blackened from soot, she would poke, and prod through yesterday's remains, hoping to find even a hint of red. A whisper of heat. A coal with just enough life to spark a new flame. If she found one, it would feel like a small victory. A single coal, barely warm, could become the heart of a new fire. She'd blow gently, shielding it with her hand, adding a curl of dry straw, a tuft of sheep's wool, a scrap of bark. And she would breathe. Long, steady breaths. Close enough to feel the heat on her nose. But not so close as to smother it. If there was no coal, no spark, she had to make one. Flint and steel. A bow drill. A wooden spindle against a wooden base, turned again and again until friction built heat. Until smoke rose from the dry dust of the hearth. Until, perhaps, a glow appeared. It was tiring. Repetitive. Often unsuccessful. If her hands were sore, or cold, it took longer. If the air was damp, it might not work at all. And if she failed, the whole house suffered. No breakfast. No warm wash water. No baking. Just a cold, lifeless silence. Wood had to be gathered constantly? It was never enough to have a pile. You needed the right kinds, dry twigs for kindling, thicker branches for steady flame, dense logs for long burn. A housewife might spend hours every week foraging in the woods, dragging back bundles of branches, tying them with rope, stacking them under shelter. And even then, wood could be a gamble. If it was too green, it would hiss and smoke, refusing to catch. If it was too wet, it would sputter and spit, filling the room with acrid steam. Only the right balance of dryness and density could fuel a proper hearth. There were no fear lighters, no kerosene, no shortcuts. Only patience, skill, and the constant awareness that one mistake meant starting over. Once lit, the fire had to be tended. Constantly. Like a demanding child. It needed feeding. More wood. The right placement of logs. A watchful eye. If it grew too hot, the food burned. If it weakened, everything slowed. She had to poke and shift, adjusting airflow, propping the logs just so, learning by feel rather than thermometer or dial. Smoke was an unavoidable companion. Chimneys were rare or poorly built. Smoke curled through rafters, clung to walls, settled into fabrics and hair. Her eyes stung constantly. Her lungs bore the price. It was just the way things were. Children often sat near the fire. It was the warmest place in the house, but also the most dangerous. A wrong step, a curious hand, and burns followed. She had to keep them safe, even while cooking, even while nursing a baby, even while thinking about the next chore. The hearth was the center of the home. Symbolically and practically. It was where bread rose, where stews simmered, where clothes dried slowly on wooden racks. Where she sat at the end of the day, blinking at the embers, fingers raw and throat hoarse. If the fire died in the night, everything, the next day became harder. She might have to borrow coals from a neighbor, carrying them wrapped in moss or ash to keep them alive. Or she'd begin again with flint and willpower. On feast days, the fire worked overtime. Multiple dishes, long hours of baking and roasting. Flames leaping high, smoke thick, temperatures unpredictable. She would sweat and choke, and shuffle hot pans with cloth-wrapped hands. But there was no resting. Not until the food was done. And then, when the fire was no longer needed, it had to be banked. Covered with ash. Tucked in. Allowed to sleep, but not die. It was an art, preserving enough heat to spark again in the morning, while preventing accidents. Fire was feared as much as it was treasured. A careless coal could burn down an entire village. A spark near a thatch roof meant disaster. She lived in constant tension. Wanting the warmth. Fearing the flame. In colder months, the fire never truly slept. Someone stayed up to feed it. To watch it. To keep the night from freezing the water, the children, the very air. Often, that someone was her. And so, every day, she repeated the process. Light. Feed. Stir. Soothe. Smoke stung her eyes. Her back ached. Her fingers were black with ash. But the fire burned. Because she made it burn. The fire was her companion. Her chore. Her test. Every day. Until the day she no longer could. And then, another woman would take her place. Kneel before the ashes. And begin again. Bread was the backbone of ancient diets. It wasn't just food. It was the meal. Morning, noon, and night. Bread filled empty stomachs. Bread kept families from starving. And before a single loaf could be baked, a housewife had to turn hard, dry kernels of grain into soft, usable flour. One handful at a time. Grinding grain was not glamorous. It was not romantic. It was not clean. It was hours of repetitive motion. Hours of pushing, pulling, pressing, circling. And the end result, barely enough flour for a day's bread. The first step was simple: fetch the grain. Wheat, barley, rye, or millet, whatever the family had. Stored in sacks, jars, or clay pots, the grain had to be sorted first. Chaff, dirt, and small stones were common. And those stones were not just annoying. If one made it into the grinding process, it could damage the millstone, or worse, crack a tooth when baked into bread. So she sat in the low light of the house, hunched over a flat basket, sifting, picking, flicking pebbles aside, watching for mold or worms. Her eyes blurred from monotony, her fingers rough from the dry husks. And all this came before the first grain even touched the stone. Most households used a corn stone, a simple grinding tool made of two flat stones, one atop the other. The bottom stayed still. The top turned. And between them, grain was crushed. Slowly. Painfully slowly. The hand corn required strength. Not a sudden, brute strength, but a steady, burning endurance. A woman would kneel, or squat beside it, legs bent, arms outstretched. She gripped a wooden handle fixed into the upper stone and began to turn. Round and round. Again and again. In smooth, tight circles. Each handful of grain would grind down into coarse flour. Not soft like modern white flour, but gritty, dense, full of bran and texture. It stuck to the stone, flew into the air, coated her hands, her arms, her lungs. By the end of the session, she would be dusted in a fine layer of flour. Her face pale, her breath dry, her sleeves caked. This was not a task she could finish quickly. Even working steadily, it could take an hour or more to grind enough flour for one large loaf. And that was only the beginning of the day's bread needs. If the household was large, or guests were expected, she had to do more. Kneel longer. Push harder. Her muscles burned. Her knees ached from the stone floor. Her wrists grew stiff. But she kept circling. Children were sometimes enlisted to help. They would try to turn the stone, laughing at first. But soon the novelty faded, and they wandered off, leaving the mother to finish what they had started. Some wealthier homes had larger millstones or even donkey-powered mills. But most did not. The burden fell on the woman. And she carried it in slow, grinding circles. The stone needed care too. It had to be kept clean. If it became too smooth, it wouldn't crush properly. If it became uneven, the flour would be inconsistent. So she would chip at it sometimes, resurface it with a hammer, maintain it like a beloved tool. Because it was. It fed her family. Some women would sing as they ground the grain. Soft, repetitive songs. Rhythmic, like the motion of the stone. A lullaby for the flour. Or a distraction from the ache in their arms. Others would pray, murmuring quiet thanks. Or pleas for strength. Or simply breathing in silence. The work left her dusty. Covered in flour, head to toe. Her skin dry. Her lips cracked. Her fingernails packed with fine powder. If water was scarce, she would stay like that for hours. Until the baking was done. Until the meals were served. Until the end of the day's tasks. And then, tomorrow, she would do it again. The basket of grain would be waiting. The stone would sit unmoving, as if mocking her. And she would kneel, place her hand on the handle, and begin turning. Again. Grinding grain was not just a chore. It was a ritual. A burden passed down through generations. From mother to daughter. From sun to moon. The flour was never enough. The bread was always needed. The circle never ended. Like the stone itself. Water, the simplest and most essential thing for life, was never simple to get in the ancient world. There were no taps to twist open, no plumbing that wound invisibly through walls. There was no reliable stream of water waiting in the corner of the kitchen. For the ancient housewife, water was a journey, a wait, a daily march that could begin before dawn and stretch into the heat of midday. Most homes had no well of their own. A well was expensive, time-consuming to dig, and dangerous if improperly maintained. A family that had a well nearby, especially a deep one, that didn't dry up in summer, was fortunate. But most housewives in villages, towns, or the countryside had to walk. Sometimes it was a short walk to a neighborhood well. Other times, it was a trek through rocky paths to a river, a spring, or a communal cistern. Always, it required effort. And often, it required patience. The trip began with a container. Pots of clay, bronze, leather, or wood. Each one heavy even before it was full. Clay jars could hold several liters, but once filled, they were almost unbearable to lift for anyone with a tired back or sore arms. Some women used yokes across the shoulders, balanced with buckets. Others carried jars on their heads, carefully cushioned with cloth rings. The method didn't matter as much as the goal: bring the water home. Imagine, for a moment, the silence of the early morning. The sun barely rising over the hills. The village still half asleep. And one woman, perhaps several, already walking down the narrow path toward water. Her footsteps soft against the dirt. Her hands clenched around the cold handles of the jar. Her eyes watching the ground, avoiding loose stones that might twist her ankle. There was danger on the path. Not always from animals or robbers, though that, too, was a possibility, but from simple missteps. One stumble could crack the pot. A broken pot was no small matter. It meant a family might go thirsty until another could be borrowed. It meant lost time, lost water, and sometimes, lost temper. The stress sat heavily on her shoulders long before the water did. At the water source, there was often a line. Other women had arrived before her. Some with children clinging to their tunics. Some already sweaty, their faces glistening. They waited, talked, and sometimes argued. There were no rules except the ones the community enforced. Don't cut in line. Don't take more than you need. Don't spill. When it was her turn, she filled the jar carefully. The cool water splashing softly inside. Her back hunched as she held it steady. Once full, it was heavier than it looked. Dozens of pounds, all balanced awkwardly. She stood slowly, testing the weight before committing to the return trip. The walk back was worse than the walk there. Now her arms ached. Her shoulders screamed. Her breath came in short bursts. But she had to move steadily. Every bump, every trip could send the water sloshing over the side. Too much lost water meant another trip. And another hour stolen from the long day. When she reached home, she poured it into a basin or jar for the day's use. This water would be everything. For drinking. For washing. For cooking. For cleaning wounds, scrubbing dishes, mixing with flour. She measured it with her eyes. She knew exactly how much she had, and how much she needed. If guests came, if a child spilled some, she'd have to go again. Sometimes, water sources dried up, or were contaminated. Then the walk became longer, and more dangerous. During droughts, women walked for miles. Past fields, along dried-up riverbeds, through mud and dust, and still returned with less than they needed. The water might be muddy, or filled with insects, but it was better than none. In wealthier homes, slaves might fetch water, or male servants, but in most families, it was the housewife. Again and again, in heat and cold, with a baby on one hip or a toddler tagging behind, she carried the burden of thirst, quietly, without thanks. And she did it knowing that tomorrow, it would be the same. There was no day when the house didn't need water. No relief from the miles. No shortcut. Just the slow walk to the well. The filling. The lifting, the carrying, and the return. The water came at a cost, not in coins, but in time, in energy, in health, in aching joints and sore backs and sunburned skin. That cost was paid every single day, without complaint, without end. Water was life. But for the ancient housewife, it was also labor, a daily test of strength, of endurance, of quiet resolve. There is a particular kind of silence that comes just before a fire begins. The world is still. The air is heavy with dampness. The smell of cold ash lingers from yesterday's heat. And in that stillness, an ancient housewife crouches by the hearth. Her fingers are black with soot before the first flame even appears. Fire was not a luxury. It was not decorative. It was essential. For warmth, for cooking, for boiling water, for light, for survival itself. Yet it was not easily summoned. There were no lighters, no matches, no click of a stove dial. Fire came from work, from skill, from patience, from daily effort. Every morning, she had to start again. If she was lucky, embers still glowed faintly beneath the previous night's ash. If she was careful, she had banked them well, covering them with ash so they might smolder through the dark hours. But if not, if the fire had died completely, she was back at the beginning. Back to striking sparks with stone and steel. Back to coaxing life from a few dry twigs. She would gather what fuel she could. Dried grasses, bark, shavings of wood, old straw. Sometimes dung, if nothing else was available. She piled it carefully, cradling it like something sacred. Because it was. A morning without fire meant a cold breakfast. Meant no hot water for cleaning. Meant discomfort that stretched into the entire day. When she lit the kindling, the smoke came first. Always the smoke. Thick, choking, swirling around her face. It clung to her hair. Crawled into her lungs. Made her eyes sting and tear. There was no chimney in most ancient homes. Just a hole in the roof, or sometimes, not even that. The smoke had nowhere to go but into the air she breathed. And she breathed it every day. From childhood to old age. A lifetime of coughing. Of soot-blackened nostrils. Of stained teeth and tired lungs. All because the fire had to be lit. And kept alive. It wasn't just a matter of lighting it. The fire demanded constant care. Feeding, adjusting, watching. If she left it for too long, it might go out. If she fed it too quickly, it might burn too hot too fast, wasting fuel that had taken hours to gather. It was a balancing act. One she performed every day, often while performing 3 or 4 other tasks at once. The hearth was the heart of the home, but also its dustiest, dirtiest corner. Ash spread across the floor like gray snow. Bits of burnt wood, scorched pottery, and greasy soot built up quickly. Cleaning it was another chore, tedious, grimy, endless. But it had to be done. Especially if the cooking pot was to sit properly on the coals. In the colder months, fire never truly went out. It became the guardian of life. A small, flickering flame kept alive through the long nights. When winds howled through the cracks in the walls, and frost crept in around the windows, she would sit up at night feeding the fire. Half asleep, half shivering, nudging coals with a stick, eyes closed but still alert. If she failed, the next day began in bitter cold. Children woke crying from the chill. Water froze in jars. Fingers numbed so badly that even tying a cloak was difficult. She couldn't afford to let the flame go out. Not once. Fuel was another problem. Wood had to be gathered, chopped, dried. If the family had access to a woodland, they were lucky. But often, she had to make do with what she could find, twigs, branches, roots. If firewood was short, she dried animal dung. It smoked worse. Smelled terrible. But it burned. In regions where winters were harsh, fuel became a form of currency. A pile of good, dry wood could be worth more than cloth. More than tools. Sometimes she would trade food to neighbors for fuel. Sometimes she simply went without, wrapped herself in blankets and hoped the next day would be warmer. The fire also had to be timed. It needed to be hot for bread, gentle for stews, strong enough to boil water, but not so strong it cracked the pot. She learned to read the flames like others read books, knew when to add kindling, when to rake the coals, when to open the door and let the smoke escape. There were burns, of course. Small ones, mostly, blisters on fingers, seared edges of sleeves. But sometimes worse. A spill. A pan that tipped. A child that got too close. There was no burn cream. No cold running water. Only herbal poultices and patience. And more fire to tend, even through the pain. Smoke seeped into every corner of the home. It settled in the thatch of the roof. It blackened the beams. It clung to clothing. Visitors could smell it before they stepped inside. But to her, it was just the smell of life. The price of feeding her family. The scent of effort. And when the day ended, the fire did not sleep. She banked the embers again, carefully piling ash over the glow, whispering a small prayer that it would still be alive in the morning, that the warmth would not vanish overnight, that she would not have to start from nothing again. Because fire, like everything else, was her responsibility. Daily. Without thanks. Without pause. She bore it as she bore everything, quietly, tirelessly, with soot on her hands and smoke in her lungs. The daily fire burned because she made it burn. Every flame was a testament to her labor. Every day began with hunger. And every hunger looked directly to the housewife. There was no pantry stocked with tins and packets. No fridge humming in the background. No takeout, no delivery, no instant anything. There was just raw, stubborn food. Grains that had to be milled. Beans that had to be soaked. Meat that had to be cleaned and butchered. And a woman who had to turn it all into nourishment, every single day, from scratch, with no days off. The first meal wasn't breakfast as we know it today. It wasn't a leisurely bowl of cereal or a hot cup of coffee. It was usually porridge, thick, slow-cooked, and made from barley, millet, or whatever grain was on hand. To make this, she had to first check the coals of the hearth, relight the fire if needed, and put on water to boil. That meant hauling it from a well, or river if she had no cistern, heavy, sloshing buckets that soaked her feet before the day had even truly begun. She had to grind the grain herself, if it wasn't done the night before. This meant squatting before a grinding stone, placing a handful of dried kernels on the lower slab, and rubbing them with a heavy upper stone in slow, repetitive motions. Back and forth. Back and forth. The motion wore down the stone and her joints alike. It took up to an hour to produce enough coarse flour for a single meal. Her shoulders ached. Her knees stiffened. The rhythm of grinding was meditative in a way, slow, dull, and without mercy. Once the grain was prepared, she stirred it into boiling water. She had to stir constantly to avoid burning. Ancient cookware was crude. Clay pots cracked. Metal was expensive. Handles got hot. And still, she worked barefoot and blinking through smoke, her children yawning behind her, waiting for something, anything, to eat. Breakfast was usually eaten in silence. But she didn't rest. Because lunch had to begin the moment breakfast ended. Bread had to be made. Vegetables had to be cleaned. Beans or lentils had to be soaked for hours before they were soft enough to cook. Everything had to be done early because the fire needed to be strong enough by midday. If the wind blew the wrong way, cooking took even longer. If the weather turned, the food might not even get hot. And regardless, mouths still expected to be fed. There was no recipe book. No written instruction. Her memory was her cookbook. Passed from her mother, and her mother's mother, every recipe had been built by habit and hope. A pinch here, a stirring there. Taste as you go. Pray it turns out edible. Preservation was always on her mind. If there were leftover scraps of fish, she had to salt them, before they spoiled. If vegetables neared the edge of rot, She might stew them into soup or pickle them in clay jars with vinegar she'd made herself. The seasons controlled everything. In winter, food was precious. In spring, it was lean. In summer, it spoiled fast. In autumn, she worked twice as hard to store what she could. The midday meal, often the largest, could include stew, if the family was lucky. This meant boiling water, adding lentils, herbs, whatever meat was available, bones, mostly, unless the family was wealthy. The stew simmered for hours, but only because she had carefully maintained the fire and stirred it to keep the bottom from burning. The entire time, she had to be near. She could not walk away. She could not rest. She fed the stew with dried herbs from bundles hung on smoky beams above. She crushed garlic with the butt of a knife. She pulled wild onions from their storage pits and scraped off the earth. Every ingredient touched her hands, from field to fire. Every meal was a ritual, not of creativity, but of obligation. There was never enough salt. Never enough clean oil. Butter was churned by hand, and rarely available. Fat was precious. Seasoning was sparse. But still she cooked. Because not cooking meant not eating. Not eating meant weakness. And weakness in ancient times meant death. She served the food without ceremony. She ate last, if she ate at all. And then, once bowls were emptied, and bread crusts gnawed down to nothing, she began again. Scrubbing wooden spoons. Rinsing clay dishes with cold water. Wiping ash and grease from the hearth. Then planning the evening meal. Dinner was simpler. Flatbread cooked on stones. Perhaps dried fruit. Perhaps cheese, if she had churned milk earlier in the week. And tea, bitter herbs steeped in hot water, drunk more for warmth and flavor. But even this light meal required effort. Effort to gather, prepare, heat, clean. There was no such thing as convenience. No such thing as a quick meal. She knew the time of day not from a clock but by the next meal that needed starting. Her life was a chain of meals. A clock made from hunger and fire. And when she lay down at night, the smell of food clung to her. Smoked fish in her sleeves. Onions in her hair. Garlic and grain ground into her fingertips. She could not wash them away. Not fully. They were part of her. She dreamed of the fire going out. Of the stew burning. Of the bread refusing to rise. Even sleep was not free from her responsibilities. And the next day, she rose again. Back to the fire. Back to the grinding stone. Back to the boiling pot. Because meals never stop. Hunger never stopped. Clothing did not come from shops. There were no size tags, no neatly folded piles of cotton tees, and no discount sales in a brightly lit market. For the ancient housewife, clothing was a responsibility that never truly ended. She was the tailor, the spinner, the weaver, the mender, and often the cleaner too. Fabric was rare. Time was short. But the need for clothing never stopped. It began with raw material. If her family raised sheep, she might shear the wool herself. This was not a clean task. Sheep did not wait patiently. They fidgeted, kicked, and carried burrs, insects, and more than a little filth in their thick coats. After shearing, she had to wash the wool, scouring it of grease and dirt in cold water, often over and over again. She did this by hand, her arms deep in murky, stinking water, her hands red and wrinkled. If her resources were humbler, flax might be grown instead. The housewife pulled the long stems from the soil, dried them in bundles, then broke them apart in a brutal process called retting. The plant had to rot slightly so the fibers would loosen. It smelled. It took weeks. But without this patient, tedious work, there would be no thread. Then came spinning. Not on a wheel, always. Not at first. The ancient housewife often used a drop spindle. A small weight at the bottom, a stick held upright, and a lot of careful twirling with her fingers. Over time, wool or flax was twisted into usable thread, yards and yards of it. Her fingers grew calloused from the friction. Her eyes strained at the fine work. And always, the thread had to be even, strong, and smooth enough to be woven. Weaving was its own daily trial. She set up a loom, either horizontal or vertical, depending on her region. Threads were strung tightly across it, a dozen at a time, and she passed the shuttle back and forth. Tap, tighten. Tap, tighten. The cloth grew inch by inch. A single square of fabric might take days. Days of crouching or standing, her body stiff, her shoulders sore. And when she finished, if she was lucky, it would be strong enough to become a tunic, a shawl, a blanket. But the labor didn't end with the cloth. She had to cut it, shape it, sew it by hand with a bone or bronze needle. Every seam was a risk. She could not waste a scrap. Mistakes were costly. Clothes were expected to last. There was no trend or fashion in her world, just utility. Clothing was patched and passed down until it fell to rags. Even those rags had use, stuffed into shoes, used for wiping, or sewn into quilts. Children grew fast. Their knees tore through cloth. Elbows wore out. She spent many nights by firelight, her eyes half closed, darning hole after hole. The needle pricked her fingers. The thread tangled. But she kept working. Because if she didn't, her family would go cold. And clothing meant more than warmth. It meant dignity. A well-kept tunic meant a family had order. A clean shawl meant pride. If someone wore torn, dirty clothes, it reflected badly on the woman who kept the house. She carried that shame. Quietly. Heavily. There were special garments, too. 4 feasts. 4 mourning. 4 weddings and births. She often had to dye the cloth using plants, berries, or minerals, each batch different, and certain, and prone to fading. She tested colors on small scraps. She boiled herbs in great pots, stirring them with sticks, waiting hours for a color that might not hold. If she succeeded, the color was modest, muted blues, faded reds, pale yellows. Rich colors like purple were for kings. If her husband's tunic wore out at the hem, she didn't buy another. She cut the bottom straight and hemmed it again. If her child tore a sleeve, she cut a scrap from an old garment and patched it. There was no such thing as throwing clothing away. Everything had a second, third, fourth life. In colder regions, she might stuff garments with wool for insulation. In wetter climates, she oiled cloaks with animal fat, or wax to make them more water-resistant. She learned by necessity. And necessity was always urgent. Her hands were rarely idle. Even as she walked to the well, she might spin wool from a distaff tucked under her arm. Even while watching the stew simmer, she might sew. In every spare moment, there was thread. And when there wasn't thread, there was guilt. The children did not understand. They wanted new things. They asked for softer fabric. Something prettier. But she had no time to explain that even the plainest cloth had taken weeks of her life. That every stitch was a sacrifice. So she nodded, smiled, and handed them another hand-me-down, clean, patched, and warm. And she wore the oldest garments herself. Always. Her tunics were threadbare. Her apron stained. Her sandals patched with twine. But she made sure her family looked presentable. That was her pride. She might go months without sewing anything new. Because repairing was more urgent. And even that, some nights, left her in tears, exhausted, sore, squinting by the weak light of a rush lamp. Her fingers stiff. Her back aching. But she never stopped. Because clothing didn't stop tearing. And cold didn't wait. And children kept growing. And her work, like so many of her other duties, was invisible. Taken for granted. But woven into every thread of ancient life. And every stitch whispered her story. Whether anyone listened or not. When a family member fell ill in ancient times, they didn't call a doctor. There was no clinic to rush to. No antibiotics waiting at a local pharmacy. No emergency number. The housewife was all of it. Nurse, caretaker, herbalist, and comforter. She bore the full weight of healing, in a world that barely understood what sickness even was. Illness was not a rare crisis, it was a constant risk. Colds, fevers, rashes, stomach aches, these arrived uninvited and lingered for days or weeks. Insects spread disease. Dirty water made people sick. Cuts and scrapes could turn into festering wounds. And the one person who was expected to know what to do in every case was the woman of the house. She couldn't just drop everything when someone got sick. There were still meals to cook, laundry to wash, children to dress, animals to feed. But she did it all anyway, with one eye always on the sick child, curled on a mat by the fire, or the husband groaning with pain in the corner. First came the physical care. She wiped brows with cool cloths. She measured fevers with her palm. She coaxed broth into reluctant mouths, spoonful by spoonful. Sometimes she burned herbs in the corner of the room, believing the smoke could drive illness out. Other times, she placed garlic or onions beneath a sick child's bed, or tied charms and tokens around their necks, because when knowledge ran out, superstition stepped in. She might brew a bitter tea from plants gathered at dawn. She knew which roots helped stomach cramps, and which leaves calmed coughing. But she also knew too much of anything could kill. So she measured carefully, watched reactions, adjusted on the fly. There were no books, no written instructions, just memory passed down from her mother, and her mother's mother, and so on. She rarely slept well during these days. If a child coughed at midnight, she was up. If someone cried out in a fever dream, she stumbled through the dark with a rushlight in hand. She was always listening, even in her sleep. And she often got sick herself. Her hands touched sores and snot and bile. Her body pressed against fevered skin. She didn't have gloves. She barely had soap. But when she fell ill, no one stepped in for her. There was no substitute. The house needed running. The fire needed feeding. The children still called her name. Some illnesses were quick, fevers that broke after 2 days. But others dragged on. A child might grow pale and thin over a month. A husband's wound might ooze for weeks. She changed bandages made from old cloths. She cleaned pus with vinegar. She kept flies away. She whispered words of comfort when there were no cures to give. There was always fear. She watched each illness with a tightening in her chest. Would it pass? Would it worsen? Death was never far in the ancient world. A cough could become a death sentence. A fever could turn into seizures. She had seen it before. And funerals were also her task. If someone died, she washed the body. She wrapped it in cloth. She comforted the others. And then, when the mourners left, she returned to her chores. The dead were gone. The living still needed her. No one gave her praise. No one said, "Nurse," with respect. Tending the sick was expected of her, like everything else. But it wore her down. Each illness took a piece of her. Still, she prepared. She dried herbs in the rafters. She saved linen scraps. She cleaned pots and hung bundles of sage or thyme. Just in case. Because she knew the next sickness was already on its way. And when it arrived, when someone groaned in the dark, or clutched their stomach, or began to shiver, she didn't panic. She sighed. She stood up. She lit a small flame. And she got to work. Again. In the ancient world, fire was not simply heat. It was survival. Fire cooked meals. Fire boiled water. Fire gave light when the sun went down. Fire dried clothes soaked by rain. Fire scared off wild animals. And in every home, the duty of tending that fire fell to the housewife. Letting the fire go out was no small mistake. There were no matches. No lighters. Not even flint was always available. Restarting a fire could take hours of rubbing sticks or stone, blowing into dry kindling until it finally caught, and even then, failure was common. If the fire died in the middle of the night during winter, the entire household might wake to bitter cold, frozen water jars, and no breakfast. So she kept it alive. Always. Every night, before crawling onto her blanket or mat, the housewife carefully banked the fire. She pushed embers together, covered them with ash, arranged pieces of wood nearby for the morning. It was a ritual. Quiet, focused, essential. One she performed even when her back ached, when her hands were blistered, when her eyes threatened to close from exhaustion. In the morning, her first task, before feeding the children, before tending to the animals, before even brushing her hair, was checking the fire. She blew softly on the ashy coals, added dry twigs, shielded the tiny flame with her hands. She watched it grow from a glow into a flicker, then into a flame that licked upward toward the pot she would soon fill with grains or water. Keeping fuel for the fire was another job altogether. She gathered dry branches from the forest edge, always watching for snakes or insects. She sent children to pick up sticks from the roadside. Sometimes she even tore old furniture apart to keep her hearth burning. Nothing was wasted. Pine cones, dried animal dung, straw, anything that burned was saved, stacked, and guarded like treasure. But the fire was more than heat. It was heart. In the evenings, families gathered around it. Children played in its glow. Husbands warmed their hands after a long day. Stories were told. Wounds were treated. Bread was baked. It was in this soft circle of light that a home felt like a home. And at the center of it was her, the one who kept the flame alive. In many cultures, fire itself was sacred, a spiritual thing. Some gods were worshipped at hearths. Women would offer prayers as they lit the morning flame, whispering thanks for warmth, pleading for safety. In this way, the fire wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was part of her identity. If guests came, the fire had to look healthy. A weak flame signaled a poor house. A strong blaze. That meant strength, care, diligence. She fed the flame with care, poking it, nudging the logs, adjusting airflow, all while pretending not to be watching it so closely. During rainstorms, she worried. Damp air made wood slow to catch. During windstorms, she feared the flame might escape. And in the heat of summer, she still had to light the fire for cooking, though it filled the small home with choking smoke. Her eyes burned. Her skin itched. But she endured it. Because the fire had to stay. If someone in the house was born, fire was burning. If someone died, fire was burning. It was there through every moment, every argument, every celebration. And she was its keeper. On some days, she stared into the flames while turning a wooden spoon in a pot, thinking of nothing. Or everything. The fire didn't talk back. It didn't cry or argue or demand. But it needed her. And maybe that was enough. Other women in the village might trade fire-starting secrets. Or swap dry wood during bad storms. Fire was a shared language between them. It connected them, even if they didn't speak much. A warm hearth in one house might save a neighbor who lost theirs to wind or rain. Even as she aged, bent by years of work, her fingers stiff and her knees aching, she still made sure the fire was tended. Younger hands might be nearby, but she always checked. Because she had spent a lifetime learning when the flame was strong enough, and when it needed help. She would sometimes wake in the dead of night and check it anyway. Just in case. She'd slip quietly from her blanket, pad across the floor, and kneel at the hearth. She'd blow gently. Wait. Listen for the soft crackle of wood. And when she heard it, her heart would settle. In a world where so much was uncertain, where crops failed, where sickness came suddenly, where war and taxes and storms could steal everything, fire was something she could control. Not always easily. Not always perfectly. But she could try. And she did. Because keeping the fire alive wasn't just about flame. It was about keeping her family warm. Keeping food on the table. Keeping the dark away. It was the quiet, glowing proof of everything she did. She wasn't remembered for it. No names were carved in stone for the women who kept the embers going. But every meal eaten warm, every child who fell asleep safely, every home that didn't freeze, owed something to the housewife and her fire. And even long after she was gone, the next generation of women knelt at the same hearths. Blew softly. Waited. listened for the spark, and lit another day. In the chaos of an ancient household, there was no such thing as peace and quiet. Not in the way we think of it today. A house was rarely silent. It was rarely still. And if it was, it probably meant something had gone terribly wrong. For the ancient housewife, managing this constant state of disorder wasn't a single task. It was a full-time, never-ending choreography of movement, words, corrections, and redirection. At any given moment, a child could be tugging at her dress, a goat could be chewing the laundry, and a husband could be demanding to know where his sandals had gone. Children were ever present. They didn't have school, and most of the time, they didn't even have toys in the modern sense. They played with sticks, mud, and anything they weren't supposed to touch. Which meant the housewife's eyes were always darting. Was the toddler too close to the fire? Was the older one trying to climb the roof again? Was someone pulling the tail of the donkey? These questions filled her thoughts as she kneaded bread or scrubbed a pot. And then there were the animals. The line between indoor and outdoor life was blurry in ancient homes. Chickens wandered in. Goats or sheep might sleep under a shelter built right next to the family's sleeping area. Pigs squealed from muddy corners. Dogs barked, and cats, if there were any, stalked around silently, often tolerated only for their ability to catch mice. The housewife kept the animals fed, kept their water clean, if she could. She milked the goats or cows if her family owned any. She mucked out stalls. She worried when a hen stopped laying eggs, or when a sheep limped. A sick animal could mean hunger for the family. So she tended them like extra children, though they were noisier, dirtier, and much harder to reason with. And of course, there were the men. Husbands, uncles, brothers, sometimes all in the same small home. They came and went, bringing with them demands and complaints and the remnants of their outside work, mud, blood, dust, and moods. Some might help, but many didn't. It wasn't expected. The house was her domain. The outside world was theirs. But when they stepped inside, they still expected the food hot, the bedding fresh, the children quiet. She kept the peace. Or tried to. She scolded children gently when they were too loud. She whispered calming words to angry husbands. She shooed animals outside before they trampled something fragile. She made space in a crowded home by rearranging objects, bodies, and expectations. There was no time off. No chance to step away for a moment. Even if she felt overwhelmed, she had to continue. A child had just spilled the flour. The goat had wandered into the cooking space. The baby was crying. The pot was boiling over. And the man of the house was asking if she remembered where he put his knife. She remembered everything. Every item. Every chore. Every face. Every bruise or blister or tick bite. She was the living memory of the house. If someone asked, "What happened to the old pot?" or "Did we feed the ox this morning?" she always knew. And if she didn't, things fell apart. She mediated conflicts. Two children fighting over a spoon. She settled it. A man and his brother arguing over land. She might not speak, but she brewed calming tea, and kept the children away while tempers cooled. She kept a schedule without clocks. She knew the time by the light through the window, or the angle of the shadows. She knew when to wake, when to bake, when to sew, when to carry water, because if she forgot or got the rhythm wrong, everything else staggered. And in the middle of all this noise and pressure and movement, she tried to keep a sense of dignity. She wore clean clothes, when possible. She tied her hair back. She swept the floor even though it would be dirty again within the hour. Not because she had to, but because it mattered. It made things feel less chaotic, even for a moment. There were no breaks. Even when she was sick. Even when she was grieving. Even when the weather turned foul, or the harvest failed. Life did not pause for housewives. They were the ones who absorbed the shocks of the world and kept things moving anyway. And so she managed it all. Children with scraped knees and questions, men with heavy boots and heavier expectations, animals that chewed, scratched, and wondered. Somehow, it worked. Not perfectly, but enough. And when the house finally grew still, when the fire was low, and the children slept and the animals were quiet, and even the men had stopped talking, she exhaled. Just for a moment. The work wasn't done. It never would be. But for now, she had held it together. She had kept order, against the odds, in the midst of a storm that never quite passed. In the modern world, when you need something, a towel, a cup, a shirt, you go to a store. You exchange money for an object. Then you bring it home, and it becomes part of your household. But in the ancient world for the housewife, that process didn't exist. She was the store. She was the factory. She was the seamstress, the weaver, the potter, the cook, the builder, the fixer. If the family needed something, she didn't buy it. She made it. With her hands, her time, and her ingenuity. And so, the home wasn't just a shelter. It was a buzzing workshop, a quiet factory where tools clattered, threads twisted, wood splintered, and fingers moved constantly. She spun fibers. She twisted wool into thread with a spindle that never left her side. Even while walking or watching children, the spinning continued, a constant rhythm, soft and silent but never ending. Once thread was made, she wove it. On vertical looms, she passed threads back and forth for hours, days, sometimes weeks, to make a single cloth. If her family was poor, she used coarse fibers, wool, flax, or nettle. If they were lucky, maybe they had a little linen or even cotton, but such luxuries were rare, and came at great cost or effort. And once she had the cloth, her work wasn't done. She cut it carefully. She stitched it with bone or bronze needles. She made shirts, tunics, cloaks, and sometimes even shoes. Nothing went to waste. Scraps became patches or bandages or stuffing for bedding. Clothes were repaired endlessly, and a single tunic might be worn by several children in succession, slowly being altered to fit smaller and smaller frames. She made soap, if she could. She rendered fat from animals, mixed it with ash, and boiled it over a smoky fire. The result was harsh, greasy, and barely recognizable by modern standards. But it cleaned. At least, it cleaned well enough. She made baskets from reeds or vines. She dried them in the sun, wove them tightly, and prayed they wouldn't unravel too soon. She made pottery, if she had the skill and access to clay. Otherwise, she patched broken pots with pitch or cloth or a miracle. She sometimes made glue by boiling hooves. She crushed berries for dye. She rubbed chalk in a cloth to lighten it. She blackened pots to hide stains. The home was never quiet. There was the scratching of fibers, the pounding of dough, the hum of chanting to stay focused, the creak of the loom. She used rocks to grind grain, and the rhythmic grinding filled the room like a heartbeat. She crushed herbs with stones, pounded garlic with sticks, and boiled mixtures in wide clay pots balanced carefully over fires that smoked endlessly and blackened everything. And through all of this, she taught. Children learned by watching her. Girls imitated her movements, practicing on scraps. Boys watched until they were old enough to be sent to fields or apprenticeships. She corrected gently when they got it wrong, or sharply, if time was short. She kept everything. A broken bowl might hold pins. A burnt cloth became a rag. A dull knife still cut something. Nothing could be thrown away. Not because of sentiment, but because resources were too precious. Making took time, and time was the most valuable currency she had. On days when she felt inspired, she added decoration. A stitch here, a pattern there. Something beautiful to break the monotony. Maybe a flower pattern stitched onto a sleeve. Maybe a clay bead made from leftover pottery scraps, painted with whatever dye she had managed to crush that week. She didn't make things for fun. She made them because they were needed. The beds needed stuffing. The sandals needed new straps. The pots were cracked again. There was no such thing as a day when nothing broke or wore down. She mended roofs with thatch. She stuffed cracks in walls with straw and mud. She polished wooden tools with fat. She reshaped bent spoons with her hands in a prayer. And when all the day's work was done, and the sun dipped low, she still found time to plan. What would need fixing tomorrow? What thread was running low? Was the cloth ready to cut? Had the children grown out of their shoes again? Every object in the home bore her mark. The stitched patch, the smoothed handle, the woven edge, the handmade bowl. Nothing was neutral. Everything had been touched, mended, created, or restored by her hands. She didn't think of it as art. She wouldn't have used that word. But it was a kind of art, an invisible, quiet one, that lived in every corner of the home. And the house, with its smoky walls and worn-down floor, stood because she made it work. Even though no one ever said thank you. Even though no one marveled at her cloth, or praised her stitching. She made everything. From almost nothing. Every single day. The life of an ancient housewife didn't run on hours and minutes. It ran on the rise and fall of the sun, on the rhythm of planting and harvest, on the shifting weight of the air in spring and the bitter bite of frost in winter. Time was circular, repetitive, and inescapable. Each season brought not only different weather, but entirely different demands. And she had to adapt every time. Spring was supposed to bring relief, but it never started gently. After a long winter of near starvation, spring arrived not with celebration, but with work. Mud. Wet clothes. Wet animals. Flooded floors. Children tracking muck indoors. Seeds had to be planted, which meant meals had to be simpler and stretched thinner. The housewife rationed dried beans and stale grain, praying the sprouts would grow. If the seeds failed, her family wouldn't eat come winter. Spring also meant cleaning, but not in the comfortable modern sense. It meant scrubbing soot from walls, shaking lice-ridden bedding, scouring clay pots blackened by months of smoke. She stitched garments ripped during winter, aired out moldy wool, and swept away the endless trails left by mice that had shared the house during the cold months. Summer brought brightness, but not ease. With sun came sweat. Water needed fetching more often. Fires became harder to manage in the heat. Bugs swarmed. Flies laid eggs on everything. Milk soured faster. Meat spoiled within hours. Food had to be dried, salted, or smoked constantly, tasks she oversaw with patience and constant motion. Her hands were busy from sunrise to sunset. She weeded garden beds with the baby slung over her shoulder. She threshed grain in the shade while children argued nearby. She carried bundles of herbs for drying. She dried laundry on bushes and stretched hides on racks. Her skin burned. Her arms itched. Her lips cracked. But still she worked because summer was the only time to prepare. And then autumn. The heaviest season. The race to store everything. Every jar filled. Every root buried. Every scrap dried. It was the most hopeful and the most terrifying time. She counted beans, measured barley, watched the apples rot too soon. She salted meat, pickled greens, packed bread into jars sealed with fat. If she did it right, the family might survive. If she misjudged the rats, the cold, or the mold, they wouldn't. Autumn also meant mending the house. She stuffed straw into roof gaps, patched clay walls, darned every sock, washed every blanket in icy water before drying it on a line that barely caught the low sun. Her hands cracked from cold and soap. Her back hurt. And still, she pushed on. Then came winter. The cruelest teacher. Firewood ran low by January. Food dwindled. Teeth chattered. The air inside the house filled with smoke from damp wood. Her children coughed. The baby wheezed. Blankets barely kept the cold away. They all slept close together for warmth. During winter, there was no rest. Just different work. She unraveled old clothes to re-knit smaller ones. She boiled bones to make broth. She scraped mold from bread. She rationed everything. She planned every meal like a mathematician working with very few numbers. The winter was when tempers flared. People were cold, hungry, and crammed together. She was the glue. She broke up fights, sang lullabies, cooked the last of the lentils, found a way to keep everyone just warm enough. When someone died, an old uncle, a frail infant, she mourned quickly and returned to work. Because death didn't stop the chores. If anything, it made more. But then, after months of biting cold and long, smoky nights, she noticed the thaw. A trickle of water. A patch of green. A bird singing again. She stepped outside, barefoot just for a moment, and let her toes feel the mud. It was still cold. Still wet. But it meant spring had come again. And she began the cycle once more. Because the year didn't stop. The chores didn't pause. The seasons just turned like a wheel, and she ran alongside, keeping her family upright with one hand while stirring the pot with the other. Her survival was quiet, slow, and unnoticed. But it was constant. Without her, no one else survived the year. Every ancient housewife carried two invisible burdens, the weight of work and the weight of what she could never have. Her daily life was a list of endless tasks, but beneath those duties lay a quiet, constant act of giving up. Giving up time. Giving up choice. Giving up self. And perhaps most painfully of all, giving up the possibility of being remembered. From the moment she was old enough to help her mother, she was trained in the art of self-erasure. Her own hunger came last. Her desires were set aside. Her body was never fully her own, not when she belonged to her father, then her husband, then to her children, and always to her duties. Her thoughts were often private, held quietly as she spun wool or scrubbed the floor. There was no one to share them with. Not really. Not in a way that made space for her, as a person rather than a function. She gave up the freedom to leave. Travel was not for her. Even going to the market might be rare, more often, others went. She stayed. Always stayed. While her world stretched no farther than the walls of her home, she learned every crack in the floor, every corner where dust collected, every creak of the door, because these became the boundaries of her existence. She gave up rest. Her body, trained for labor, had no break. Even pregnancy didn't exempt her, it merely added weight to carry while she cooked or fetched water. Even childbirth didn't pause her chores, it just added an infant to care for while spinning yarn. Her sleep was interrupted by coughs, cries, and the cold. Her joints hurt early. Her back bent before old age. She gave up beauty. Not because she was not beautiful, but because there was little time or energy to care for it. Her hands were rough from grinding grain. Her hair smelled of smoke. Her clothes were patched many times over. She might have once liked jewelry, ribbons, or soft cloth, but those became impractical indulgences. There was no room for vanity, when every day was survival. She gave up ambition. Or rather, she was never allowed to develop it. A housewife in the ancient world could not become a scholar. Could not run a city. Could not build a monument with her name engraved. Her knowledge was practical, passed down woman to woman, mouth to ear, never written, never recorded. No history book listed her name. No poet praised her skill at stretching meals, or repairing worn tunics. She gave up space to grieve. If her child died, she cried silently, often while working. If she miscarried, she buried the pain under a day's tasks. If her husband struck her, she bore it quietly, or fled, depending on what world she lived in. And still, she rose again the next morning to knead the bread and milk the goat. Because if she didn't, no one else would. She gave up the right to complain. Exhaustion was expected. Silence was virtue. Gratitude was demanded. Even if no one thanked her. Even if no one noticed what she gave. And yet, within all this giving, she somehow remained a person. Somehow carved out small moments. She might have sung softly to herself while mending. Might have whispered jokes to a neighbor while washing clothes. Might have stolen a smile at a baby's laugh. These small rebellions, so quiet, so brief, were what kept her soul alive. Her sacrifices were not always bitter. Some were given freely. She may have loved fiercely. Taken pride in a well-swept floor. in a meal stretched to feed many, in a child's mended shirt that held through another season. But the pride was private. There were no medals, no statues, just the quiet knowledge that, once again, she had kept her world turning. In her silence, there was strength. Not dramatic, not loud, but enduring. She did what needed doing, over and over, in the face of illness, poverty, loss, and exhaustion. And she never expected praise. That silence, the one she lived in every day, is the same silence that kept her from the pages of history. We know the names of kings and generals. We rarely know the name of the woman who kept their hearths warm, who raised their sons, who made the meals, wove the clothes, soothed the fevers, and buried the dead. But she was always there. In every household. In every season. Sacrificing in silence. The ancient housewife did not write history. She didn't carve her name into stone tablets, or dictate epic poems to scribes. She had no scrolls, no statues, no grand tombs built in her honor. Her hands were too busy. Stirring porridge, not ink. Folding cloth, not pages. But her presence, her effort, never disappeared. It clings to the edges of history, like dust in the corners of an old home. Subtle, nearly forgotten, but still there. When archaeologists unearth ancient homes, they find broken pots, burnt food scraps, spindle whorls, combs, and grain mills. These are her monuments. Not made to last, but somehow they remain. Pieces of her life preserved not because she wanted to be remembered, but because the things she used were woven into daily life so completely, they became inseparable from human survival. We often study the past through war and empire, through kings and temples. But beneath all of that, stood the daily labor of women who kept the fire going. If the household collapsed, nothing else stood. Soldiers don't march without food. Priests don't pray without clean robes. Scribes don't write if the ink freezes, or their clothes rot, or the baby won't stop crying. The housewife, this often unnamed, unacknowledged person, was the center of the ancient human ecosystem. Every garment, every bite of food, every stitch, every scab bandaged, was likely her doing. She made sure children grew into adults. She held families together across decades. She stored food, brewed beer, spun wool, taught language. She carried a lineage of knowledge, passed on by hand, by memory, by repetition, not by parchment. And yet, most of us do not know her name. There is no record of her voice. Her story wasn't written down. But if we listen carefully to the spaces between the great names of history, if we pause and look not at the kings but at the kitchens, they appear. Glimpses of her life hide in tax records and grain inventories. In letters between men that mention a wife making butter. In the shape of a house organized not for guests but for tasks. In the grooves worn into grinding stones. The very structure of civilization rested on her unpaid, unseen labor. And perhaps the most haunting truth is that this hasn't changed much. Today, across much of the world, women still perform the vast majority of unpaid domestic labor. They still wake before the sun, pack lunches, sweep floors, wash clothes, care for the sick, and make homes livable. The tools are newer. The conditions sometimes better. But the pattern is old. Older than writing. Older than kings. Her work still matters. Because it was never optional. Her labor kept people alive. It laid the foundation for everything else. Every field plowed, every sword forged, every temple built, none of it happened without someone first cooking the food, cleaning the wound, raising the child. There is something deeply human in imagining her quiet persistence. Something deeply humbling in acknowledging that history's greatest achievements sat atop her broom, her basin, her fire epit. And so, when we study the past, we must not only look up at the marble pillars and golden crowns, we must look down. Down to the hearth. Down to the washing stones. Down to the frayed edge of a hand-woven shawl. In the dust, we find her. Still present. Still necessary. Still unthanked. But never forgotten. It always began before the sun. Not when the rooster crowed, because by then, she was already working. In the gray hush of pre-dawn, while others snored in dreamless sleep, the ancient housewife would rise on aching limbs, her hands already curling with remembered motions. The fire must be kindled. The ashes stirred from yesterday's coals. She'd crouch, smoke stinging her eyes, blowing softly into the brittle kindling, her breath mixing with the smoke, until orange sparks glowed like stubborn stars. This was how her day began, before the light, before the warmth, before any help. Her first chore was always the fire. Without it, there was nothing else, no warmth, no food, no clean water. Sometimes the fire had died overnight, and she'd have to beg a neighbor for a coal. That meant walking barefoot through cold dirt lanes with a clay dish, and shame in her throat. If she was lucky, she could get it burning again before the baby woke. If not, the whole house stirred hungry and cold. With the fire smoldering, she'd start to boil water, drawn from a communal well, or river the day before, or, if she ran out, she'd have to trudge out in the darkness with a heavy jug. The water would need to be warmed for washing hands, faces, or soaking grains. Next came the grain. No quick bowl of cereal, only coarse, dry kernels stored in sacks and jars. She poured them into a hollowed stone mortar, and began the long, rhythmic, mind-numbing grind. Grind, lift, drop. Grind, lift, drop. Over and over. The grinding stone was heavy, and her arms ached before the first batch of meal was done. The stone ground down her hands as much as the grain. She would be dusted in flour before sunrise. It would sneak into her fingernails, into her lashes, up her nose. Her cough was always dry. Her back was always sore. And then the bread, coarse and unleavened, the dough kneaded with salted fingers, and set beside the fire to cook on flat stones or inside clay ovens that smoked and hissed. There were no thermostats, no timers. Just instinct and experience. If the bread burned, there would be no second batch. If it undercooked, the family ate it raw. She would serve it with porridge, if there was time. Sometimes thin soup. Most of the time, breakfast was dry, and it was quiet, no one praised her. They just ate. By the time the household began to stir, children needing dressing, husbands needing shirts, elderly in-laws groaning from mats, the housewife had already done hours of labor. Now came laundry. Not with soap and machines, but by hauling clothes to the nearest stream or wash area, bending over with a paddle or rock, scrubbing out stains with sand and grit. Clothes were beaten, rinsed, wrung by hand, hung on bushes to dry. In winter, the water would freeze around her ankles. In summer, her fingers blistered from sun and friction. There were no gloves. No breaks. After laundry came cleaning. The hearth must be swept. Ashes shoveled out, pots scrubbed with ash and straw. Floors, dirt or wood, must be cleared of animal droppings, spilled grain, or muddy footprints. Sometimes this included patching leaky roofs with straw, or stuffing cracks in the walls with mud. Every hour brought more small crises. A fire that wouldn't catch. A pot that cracked. A chicken that disappeared. A toddler who wandered off. The midday meal had to be prepared. That meant more grinding, more boiling, more chopping. If she had a garden, she'd need to tend it, pulling weeds, checking for pests, watering the roots. If food was scarce, she might need to forage berries, herbs, bitter greens. Everything took longer than it should have. Every step meant more steps. Gathering wood. Sharpening knives. Fetching more water. Always the water. Heavy, precious, carried with aching arms. Sometimes uphill. In the afternoon, when the sun was high, and the dust hung in the air, she sewed. Mending tunics, weaving wool, spinning flax. Thread was made by hand, every inch of it. Spinning required calm focus and hours of practice. She'd do it while walking, while tending animals, even while breastfeeding. If clothes wore out, there were no shops. She had to make new ones, stitch by stitch. Dyes were made from bark, clay, or crushed insects. There were no instructions, no patterns, only memory and time. Dinner was not glamorous. The same porridge again. Maybe with beans. Maybe with fish, if luck favored her or the family had means. She cooked while hungry, often feeding others first. If guests came, she cooked more, cleaned more, smiled more. Hospitality was a duty, even if it drained the pantry. She always worked in silence. Quiet was safer. And when night fell, the chores continued. Children needed washing, or comforting from nightmares. Animals had to be brought in. Lamps filled with oil. The fire must be banked to survive the night. She would collapse onto her straw mat with her back stiff, her feet sore, her hair full of ash. And if a child cried in the night, or someone took ill, she rose again. Without question. Without pause. Sleep came only when the work was done. Which meant, never. There is something especially cruel about hard work, made harder by the very tools meant to help. For ancient housewives, this was the daily truth. Every object in their life, from the grinding stone to the cooking pot, was primitive, heavy, and breakable. Not because they were poorly made, but because this was the best the world could offer. Technology, such as it was, belonged to war, or worship, or men. The tools of women were basic and changed, and often barely improved from the Stone Age. Their lives were long repetitions of motion and strain, made more exhausting by every splintered handle, every stone that chipped, every pot that cracked. Let us begin with the cornstone, the grinding mill. In most ancient homes, grain could not be eaten without first being pounded or ground into flour. The hand corn was the answer. It consisted of two heavy stones, the bottom one hollowed slightly to hold the grain, the top one shaped to rotate. The woman would pour dry kernels into the bowl and rotate the upper stone, sometimes with a wooden handle, sometimes just with her palms. Over and over. The motion was circular. Grinding. Grinding. It was slow, and it was hard, and it had to be done daily. Some women would spend several hours a day just turning that stone, breathing in flour dust, feeling the stone wear away the skin on their hands, and the patience in their minds. When it came time to cook, the hearth was her stove, and it had no knobs, no doors, no precision. A fire was coaxed from embers or sparks, then fed with wood or dung. Heat was inconsistent. Flames flared or died suddenly. Pans had no insulation. Most cookware was clay or iron, both of which retained heat poorly or burned unpredictably. If the pot cracked, it was a disaster. Clay vessels were fragile. Some were lined with sand or straw, but even those could crumble under pressure or fire. Dropping a pot meant losing the vessel, the meal, and often the fuel as well. She had no metal forks. She had no knives that were sharp without frequent grinding. If she owned a knife at all, it was shared among the household. Often, it was dull, and had to be sharpened by hand using stones. Cutting meat or vegetables was slow and painful. Her hands bore nicks and calluses. She did not have potholders. She had cloth, sometimes wet, often thin, to grasp hot pots and pans from open flames. Burn scars were common. Water, the essential ingredient of all cleaning and cooking, came not from taps but from wells, springs, or rivers. Carrying it was its own kind of punishment. Vessels were made of clay, wood, or leather, none ideal. Clay cracked. Would leak. Leather stank. Each trip with water added weight to her day. A single full jug could weigh over 40 pounds. That was just for the morning. She might make the trip 4 or 5 times. And if a vessel slipped from her hand on the way home, mud, laughter from others, and the walk repeated. For laundry, she had no soaps in the modern sense. She used ash, clay, sand, or sometimes stale urine, fermented into an alkaline cleaner. It smelled foul but worked. Clothes were beaten against rocks or slabs of wood. There were no washboards, no scrubbing brushes. She bent over for hours, dunking, scrubbing, twisting, rinsing. Her back ached. Her knees pressed into wet dirt. Her hands grew raw and red. The water numbed her fingers in cold seasons. In hot seasons, insects bit her ankles as she worked. She hung the clothes on sticks, bushes, or ropes, if she had rope. If it rained, she started over. Spinning thread required the drop spindle, an ancient but delicate tool. It was a weighted stick that she had to twist by hand, drawing out the fibers from wool or flax. It took immense concentration. Hours to produce even a small ball of thread. If the fiber snapped, she had to tie it and smooth it. Weaving came next, often with a vertical loom made of wood. She stood or sat feeding the threads, knotting, beating them into place. It could take days to make enough fabric for one garment. If one beam of wood cracked, if one fiber tangled beyond fixing, the whole cloth could be ruined. Even cleaning the house came with poor tools. Her broom was not plastic, it was a bundle of stiff reeds, tied roughly together. It scattered more dust than it collected. The floor was dirt, not tile, and had to be raked smooth, sometimes wet down to control the dust. If there were pests, ants, rats, fleas, there was little she could do. She had no chemicals, no traps, only vigilance and prayers. Her sewing needles were bone or bronze. Her thread was rough. She stitched by hand, squinting at fabric by firelight. If a stitch came undone, she redid it. If her needle snapped, she might not have another. Everything was slow. Everything was fragile. Everything depended on her patience. There were no shortcuts. No running water, no electricity, no protective gear. Her hands were her tools, and her tools punished her hands in return. There was no praise when she succeeded. Only expectation. If something broke, she was blamed. If something wore out, she must fix it. Every object in her life demanded effort, and offered very little mercy. She was surrounded by tools that didn't help. They just made the chore barely possible. And so she labored, not with grace or ease, but with endless repetition and quiet resentment. Not because she lacked strength, but because the world never gave her anything better. In ancient times, the economy was not just measured by coins, trade, or temples. It was measured, day after day, by what women did at home, quietly, without accounting, and usually without thanks. The unpaid, unseen labor of housewives formed the invisible foundation of entire civilizations. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. But without it, society would have collapsed before the first empire was born. You see, in a world without grocery stores, delivery services, or even basic kitchen convenience, every single necessity had to be made from scratch. And the person doing that work, grinding grain, baking bread, drawing water, spinning cloth, cooking food, raising children, and maintaining the household, was almost always the housewife. These chores were not just routine. They were critical infrastructure. When they didn't happen, people starved, froze, or fell ill. Let's take bread, the foundation of almost every ancient diet. Before it could be eaten, the housewife had to grow or barter for the grain, dry it, store it safely away from insects, grind it into flour using heavy stones, knead it by hand with sour water, or leaven, shape it, and bake it over a fire or in a communal oven. Each of these steps was manual, muscle-powered, and time-consuming. And yet she did it, every day, for everyone. That bread, consumed quickly by her family, was the result of countless hours of labor. Clothing, too, didn't come from shops. The housewife had to clean raw wool or flax, spin it into thread, weave it into fabric, cut the cloth, sew it by hand, and maintain it over time. And once the clothes wore out, as they did often from sun, sweat, and wear, she had to patch, rework, or start over. All while the rest of the household continued to demand warmth and modesty. When it came to the economy, her work didn't generate coins, but it saved them. Every item she created or repaired was one that didn't need to be purchased or bartered for. Every task she did at home, whether washing, cleaning, or preserving food, kept the household functioning without external help. In that way, she wasn't just a caretaker. She was the beating heart of the microeconomy of the family. And yet, Despite her essential role, her labor was invisible in official records. Ancient tablets, scrolls, and inscriptions often noted the taxes paid by a household, or the grain owed to a landlord, but they didn't record how the food was prepared or how the home was maintained. The state might count cattle and coin, but it rarely counted labor done with calloused hands and tired shoulders. In many cultures, women's domestic labor was so normalized that it wasn't even seen as work. It was expected, natural, part of her role in life. From Greece to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to early Rome, women's days began before dawn and ended long after sunset. Their economies ran on sweat and silence. And beyond her own household, the housewife often supported wider networks of trade and exchange. She bartered cloth for grain, exchanged extra oil for herbs, or traded preserved goods at local markets. Though she may not have called herself a merchant, her handiwork sustained the local economy. In marketplaces, much of what was sold came from women's domestic labor: baskets, clothes, food, salves. The economy, especially in rural or poor areas, wasn't built on coins. It was built on trade, and she was a quiet pillar of it. Even in wealthier homes, where slaves or servants helped, the housewife remained in charge of managing the domestic economy. She rationed supplies, ensured proper storage, oversaw food preparation, and organized labor. Mistakes meant waste. Waste meant hunger. She had no spreadsheets or budgeting tools, just memory, observation, and long experience. Illness, too, fell under her domain. Without professional medicine, she became the healer. She gathered herbs, prepared poultices, administered broths. The economy of survival ran through her hands. When a child fell ill, or a husband was injured, it was she who kept the household going, often while suffering herself. And when disaster struck, a fire, a flood, a famine, it was her labor that rebuilt the rhythm of life. Men might repair walls or defend the village, but she restored the home. She mended clothes. She fed children from scraps. She planted again. The domestic economy didn't collapse because she didn't. It's easy, from our modern view, to underestimate just how complex this system was. Modern conveniences like canned food, refrigeration, sewing machines, and running water have erased the full memory of how hard domestic life once was. In ancient times, every single task was a process, one that required knowledge, time, and muscle. A loaf of bread wasn't just a snack, it was a project. A clean shirt wasn't just routine, it was a multi-day labor. A warm home wasn't luck, it was fuel gathered, fire tended, and clothes patched. So, while temples honored gods, and kings built empires, and merchants counted coins, the housewife built life. With no title, no ceremony, and often no choice. Her economy didn't collapse during crisis because it had already weathered endless small ones: sick children, broken tools, empty pots. Through it all, she adapted, saved, created, and held everything together. She was never paid, but everything was built on what she did. In modern life, time is measured by clocks, calendars, and alarms. There are schedules, work hours, designated weekends, and moments, however brief, set aside for rest. But in the ancient world, especially for women tasked with the burden of household care, time had no such mercy. There was no off switch. No separation between work and rest. No day that wasn't absorbed entirely by the constant demands of survival. For the ancient housewife, the day began long before sunrise. Before the first bird stirred or the first rooster crowed, she was already awake, stoking the fire from its night-long embers. A cold hearth meant a slow start. A slow start meant hunger. Time, for her, was not a luxury or a tool. It was a force that pulled her forward whether she was ready or not. Morning hours passed in a quiet flurry of tasks: grinding grain with heavy stones, boiling water over smoky flames, feeding children or animals, preparing food for the day ahead. There were no shortcuts. Every motion required strength and repetition. Even something as seemingly simple as fetching water was a trek, A weighty walk to and from the nearest stream, well, or communal basin, repeated multiple times a day. By mid-morning, the chores changed but the labor didn't lessen. Laundry, if done, meant hauling water again, soaking and scrubbing cloth with ash or clay, wringing it out by hand, then hanging it to dry, often in dusty air. Cleaning was a daily ritual, not for beauty or shine but to keep pests and disease at bay. Sweeping floors, shaking out bedding, chasing away insects, these were survival, not aesthetics. There was no such thing as being done. The minute one task ended, another began. Bread dough needed watching. Children cried. Chickens escaped. Food spoiled if left too long in the heat, or if rats found the way in. In the ancient home, every object was a potential failure point, and every failure meant more work. Afternoon brought its own burdens. The housewife might spin wool, weave thread, or repair clothing. If a family had animals, she might help in milking, shearing, or feeding. In fields, she might assist in planting, harvesting, or carrying heavy baskets of crops. Women were not confined solely indoors, they were expected to serve as agricultural laborers when needed. There was no such thing as, not your job. It was all her job. As daylight began to fade, the pace never slowed. Dinner had to be prepared with whatever scraps remained. Tools cleaned and stored. Children bathed, if water allowed. Lamps lit with precious oil or candles carefully rationed. And even then, when the house grew dark and quiet, the work was not finished. There was mending to do by firelight, preserving food, grinding more grain for the morning, or simply preparing the home for the next day's onslaught. When she finally lay down to sleep, if she had a bed at all, it was rarely alone, rarely comfortable, and never uninterrupted. Children needed feeding. Someone might fall ill. A storm could damage the roof. Or worse, raiders, soldiers, or wild animals might appear. Sleep was not a promise. It was an intermission, if she was lucky. The exhaustion was physical, but also mental and spiritual. There was no end to the cycle, no vacation, no festival that didn't come with extra work. Holidays meant more cooking, more guests, more cleaning. Even moments of ritual or religious observance had to be earned by increased toil before and after. The concept of rest as restoration, something for the self, was alien. Rest was only meaningful if it allowed her to return to work the next day. In literature or history, you often hear of ancient battles, great speeches, dazzling monuments. But these grand events happened while women labored invisibly. When soldiers marched, it was women who kept the farms alive. When kings feasted, it was women who roasted the meat, scrubbed the dishes, and cared for the servers' children. Time did not stop for them. If anything, it moved faster, swallowing each day whole with new demands. And the worst part, perhaps the quietest injustice, was that this work was seen as natural. Not noble. Not respected. Just expected. A woman who collapsed from exhaustion was weak. A woman who asked for help was lazy. Her tired hands, her sore feet, her red eyes, these were not signs of heroism. They were simply part of being alive. Even as age crept in, wrinkling her skin, weakening her knees, there was no retirement. An older housewife became a caretaker to grandchildren or an assistant to daughters. Her wisdom was valued, yes, but it came attached to more chores. And if she was widowed or childless, she often had to rely on others, continuing to work just to stay useful, just to avoid being discarded. The days didn't grow shorter with age. They grew heavier. Each sunrise brought the same ritual. Each sunset the same weariness. But the alternative, idleness, was not allowed. Idleness was sin. Waste. Dishonor. She had to move. Had to clean. Had to feed. Until she couldn't. Time for the ancient housewife was not a friend. It was a force, demanding, relentless, uncaring. It dragged her through life, counting not her joys, but her repetitions. And when her body finally gave out, she slipped from the world not with tribute or titles, but perhaps with her hands still sore, and her name remembered only by those she fed,